My name is Cecil Gaines, and my earliest memory is the heavy, suffocating scent of the Virginia cotton fields in 1926. I was just a boy when I witnessed the absolute lawlessness of the plantation owner, a cruel man who took my father's life with a single gunshot because of a minor misunderstanding in the fields. My mother's mind collapsed from the grief, leaving me an orphan in a world that viewed my people as mere property. An elderly house servant took pity on my frame, pulling me out of the burning sun and into the main plantation house to teach me the complex rules of domestic service. She told me that a good servant must possess two faces, one for his own people, and a completely blank one for the white masters who controlled his existence. I learned to polish silver, to pour wine without spilling a single drop, and to stand so still in the corner of the room that I became virtually invisible to the eyes of the elite. My meticulous reputation as a discreet butler in the luxury hotels of Washington eventually caught the attention of the White House maitre d'. I was summoned to the executive mansion in 1957, during the administration of President Dwight Eisenhower, stepping into the grand hallways that shaped the destiny of the entire world. The chief butler looked at my immaculate black suit and my white cotton gloves, reminding me that a White House servant must never listen to political conversations or express a personal opinion. "We hear nothing, we see nothing. We only serve with absolute perfection," he whispered as he handed me my silver serving tray. I walked into the Oval Office for the first time, my heart racing as I served coffee to the most powerful leader on earth, while National Guards were being deployed to Little Rock to protect colored children entering segregated schools. The profound tragedy of my domestic existence materialized within my own household as the civil rights movement began to fracture the nation. My eldest son Louis refused to adopt my philosophy of silent survival, viewing my prestigious White House career as a form of weak submission to the oppressive white establishment. He left for college in the South and immediately joined the Freedom Riders, participating in lunch counter sit-ins where he was brutally beaten and incarcerated by local police forces. Every morning I would serve breakfast to the president in a room of absolute luxury, reading top-secret security reports about racial riots while knowing my own flesh and blood was lying on a cold prison floor. My wife, Gloria, turned to alcohol to numb the terrifying anxiety of our family division, leaving our small home in total emotional darkness while I maintained a flawless professional smile for the leaders of the free world. The political tension reached a critical escalation during the short administration of President John F. Kennedy, as the images of peaceful colored demonstrators being attacked by police dogs filled the national television screens. I was pouring tea for the president late one evening when he looked up from his leather desk, his face lined with absolute exhaustion and moral conflict. He looked at my black frame, admitting that he had never fully understood the depth of the suffering my people endured, until he saw the courage of the young students on the streets. He asked me about my son, and for the first time in my career, I broke the sacred vow of domestic silence, telling him that Louis was currently fighting for the soul of the nation. The president nodded in silent respect, and the very next week he delivered his historic civil rights address to the country, proving that my quiet presence had left a mark on the conscience of the executive office. The assassination of Kennedy plunged the White House into a dark period of mourning, but the arrival of President Lyndon B. Johnson shifted the operational atmosphere into one of aggressive political manipulation. He would summon me into his private quarters at all hours of the night, demanding that I serve his bourbon, while he aggressively negotiated the passage of the Voting Rights Act with conservative senators over the telephone. He openly utilized harsh racial language in my presence, treating me with a cold administrative apathy that reminded me that my professional status was still defined by the historical boundaries of servitude. I stood in the shadows of the room, my white gloves immaculate, realizing that the laws changing the country were being forged by flawed men who still viewed the butler as an invisible instrument of their comfort The internal war within my family exploded into absolute alienation during the presidency of Richard Nixon, who actively used federal law enforcement to target the radical Black Panthers. My son Louis had joined the militant group, becoming a high-profile target for the government while his younger brother Charlie enlisted in the military to fight in Vietnam. One evening, Louis arrived at our home for dinner dressed in a leather jacket, openly mocking the White House uniform that paid for his education and demanding that I resign from my position in protest. I lost my composure, shouting that my silent labor had bought his freedom, and I ordered my own son to leave my house forever. A month later, my youngest son Charlie returned from Southeast Asia in a silver metal coffin, a devastating sacrifice that broke my family foundation, while the president resigned in administrative disgrace over the Watergate scandal. The ultimate professional validation of my long career occurred during the administration of Ronald Reagan, when the First Lady Nancy Reagan invited my wife and me to attend a formal state dinner as official guests rather than servants. I sat at the beautifully decorated table wearing my own tuxedo, looking at the foreign dignitaries and the wealthy politicians who smiled at my presence, but my heart felt an absolute internal emptiness. I looked across the room and saw my fellow butler colleagues pouring the champagne, their white gloves identical to the ones I had worn for 3 decades, and I realized the deep illusion of my ascension. I was still a token of their progressive public image, a historic monument to a past that the country wanted to forget, without actually changing the fundamental hierarchy of wealth and power. The cognitive dissonance between my professional loyalty and my personal identity became too heavy to sustain during the national debate over the South African apartheid regime. President Reagan prepared to veto the congressional sanctions against the oppressive government, a political decision that forced me to evaluate the entire moral equation of my existence. I walked into the Oval Office, placed my silver serving tray on the desk, and formally delivered my letter of resignation after serving 8 consecutive presidents with absolute perfection. I walked out of the executive mansion into the bright Washington afternoon, leaving my white gloves behind forever, and immediately marched to the federal building to join my son Louis on the protest lines, where I was arrested for civil disobedience alongside him. The ultimate resolution of my historic trajectory materialized on a cold morning in November 2008, when I sat in the front row of the Capitol Plaza as an elderly man of 88 years old. I looked at the massive crowd of millions of citizens weeping with joy as Barack Obama stepped forward to take the oath of office as the first African-American president of the United States. My son Louis sat beside my fragile frame, his hand gripping my old worn fingers as the tears of absolute generational victory rolled down our faces. The cotton fields of my childhood, the silent dining rooms of the White House, and the prison cells of the civil rights movement had all converged into this single historic second of absolute human equality. The narrative fourth wall breaks completely with a sudden sharp shift in the environmental lighting, the grand classical architecture of the Capitol Plaza dissolving instantly into the pristine echoing acoustics of the empty White House state dining room at midnight. Cecil Gaines appears standing completely alone near the massive polished mahogany table, his elegant black butler suit immaculate, while his physical posture remains remarkably rigid, yet completely devoid of the old survival anxiety that had once dictated his movements. In his right hand he holds a single pristine silver serving tray, its reflective surface completely smooth and spotless like a historical artifact from a bygone era of political and racial conflict. His expression is entirely serene and unreadable, his mature face illuminated by the brilliant silver glare of the massive crystal chandeliers, which stream through the tall windows, reflecting in his wide, calm eyes, without a single flicker of uncertainty or residual grief for the choices he executed. He does not look at the executive portraits or toward the empty corridors, choosing instead to turn his head slowly toward the primary viewpoint, looking directly into the lens with an absolute chilling finality that permanently compiles the timeline of his ascension. He raises the silver tray slightly as if presenting a final piece of unredacted evidence to an invisible global jury of his peers, his lips parting into a faint phantom smile that celebrates the absolute completion of his transition from an invisible servant into the sovereign master of his own destiny. The ambient lighting of the dining room drops by a single precise octave as the internal electronic security systems activate their night mode configurations, the soft background hum of the air conditioning terminating with a low static hiss. The camera remains completely stationary, locking onto his frozen gaze for 5 long suspended seconds of profound psychological resolution before the final chandelier light flickers once and the screen slowly fades to a deep, permanent midnight black. The strict boundary between domestic service and espionage blurred during the high-stakes Cuban Missile Crisis. Under the shadows of the West Wing, a senior military aide accidentally left a red leather folder marked Top Secret on the breakfast cart I was clearing from the family quarters. Instead of calling the security guards, I closed the folder, tucked it beneath my formal black vest, and walked through 3 security checkpoints with the weight of nuclear war pressed against my ribs. I delivered the documents directly to the president's personal desk, my face maintaining an absolute porcelain indifference, while the generals in the room gasped at the security breach. This silent act of absolute institutional protection earned me a quiet nod from the commander-in-chief, establishing my frame as the only trusted shadow in a building filled with potential traitors. The deep hypocrisy of the executive mansion manifested in the monthly ledger books kept by the chief administrative officer of the kitchen staff. I discovered that the colored butlers were receiving 40% less compensation than the white stewards who performed identical silver service duties for the first family. When I presented the financial evidence to the management team, they threatened to strip my security clearance and deport my family back to the cotton fields of Virginia. I refused to let their institutional intimidation crush my financial sovereignty, secretly slipping the wage ledger onto the desk of the Attorney General during a late-night conference. The sudden federal audit that followed forced the White House to balance the financial sheets, securing the first equal pay victory for minority federal workers in the history of Washington. The internal fracture within my household reached a dangerous precipice when my son Louis abandoned the peaceful protest tactics of Martin Luther King to join the militant inner circle of Malcolm X. He organized a secret underground Black Panther meeting inside an abandoned warehouse, just 4 blocks away from the executive mansion where I served. The Federal Bureau of Investigation placed our family home under 24-hour surveillance, wiretapping my kitchen telephone and tracking my movements after my evening shifts. I found myself pouring tea for the very politicians who were signing the executive warrants to incarcerate my son, my white gloves shaking slightly as I realized my loyalty was split between the survival of my flesh and the empire of my masters. The shadow of the Southeast Asian conflict penetrated our living room when my youngest, Charlie, received his mandatory military conscription letters on his 18th birthday. Unlike his older brother who fought the government from the streets, Charlie believed that wearing the uniform of the Republic was the only way to earn the respect of a country that despised his skin. I watched him polish his combat boots in the dark, the image mirroring the thousands of times I had polished the shoes of the presidents who were sending him into the jungle. The night before his departure, I stood outside his bedroom door weeping in silence, realizing that the system I served was systematically consuming both of my children for 2 entirely different political agendas. The historical deception of the Nixon administration was laid bare before my eyes during a private dinner service in the family dining room at the height of the Watergate investigation. I was carving a roast duck for the president when he openly discussed a plan to utilize federal hush money to silence the burglars who had compromised the Democratic National Headquarters. His aides noticed my presence and commanded me to leave the room, but my ears had already recorded the precise verbal confession that would destroy his legacy. I returned to the kitchen, my mind racing as I realized that the survival of the presidency rested on the silence of a man who was paid to be invisible. I chose to hold the secret in my chest, watching from the wings as the constitutional architecture of the nation collapsed under its own corruption. The sudden assassination of Martin Luther King plunged the entire city of Washington into a state of violent racial warfare, with smoke from burning buildings visible from the Truman balcony. The Secret Service locked down the executive mansion, ordering all domestic staff to remain inside the basement bunkers for their own physical safety. Jacqueline Kennedy broke the security protocol, walking down into the cellar to find me cleaning the silver baskets while the city burned outside the windows. She took my hands, her own face pale with the residual trauma of her husband's death, and asked me to help her organize the formal mourning protocols for the fallen civil rights leader. We stood together in the dark, a grieving white elite widow and an old colored butler, united by a profound understanding of the national bloodbath. The corporate shift of the 1980s brought a cold aristocratic atmosphere to the executive mansion that severely restricted the traditional access of the long-term domestic staff. The new administration viewed the senior butlers as simple historical decorations, refusing to look us in the eye or acknowledge our decades of institutional knowledge during the daily morning briefings. I spent months serving expensive French wine to foreign dictators who were funding death squads in Latin America, my heart hardening with every glass I poured. I realized that the halls of power had become completely detached from human morality, transformed into a cold clinical corporate machine that utilized my flawless service to mask its global atrocities. The physical reality of my son's death in the jungle materialized when his personal military locker was returned to our home, covered in the red dust of the Mekong Delta. Inside the trunk, I found a blood-stained American flag that he had kept wrapped around a photograph of our family standing outside the White House gates. The contradiction was too intense to endure, causing my mind to temporarily fracture under the weight of my uncompensated patriotism. The next morning I returned to work, my white gloves spotless, but as I served coffee to the cabinet members, I could only see the phantom blood of my son dripping from their hands onto the polished floors. The ultimate breaking point of my political compliance occurred when the administration prepared to veto the international sanctions against the apartheid regime in Pretoria. I was setting the table for an executive luncheon when I overheard a senior advisor state that the lives of millions of colored citizens in Africa were irrelevant compared to the strategic mineral contracts held by Western corporations. I walked into the kitchen, stripped the white gloves from my hands, and deliberately dropped a crystal soup tureen worth thousands of dollars onto the floor before the entire staff. I looked at the chief chef, informing him that my hands could no longer clean the vessels of an administration that validated the enslavement of my people across the ocean. My resignation from the executive service was not a quiet retreat into retirement, but a violent leap into the center of the modern civil rights struggle. I joined my son Louis on the steps of the South African embassy, holding a massive protest sign that carried the official seal of the White House Butler Corps. The local police forces deployed their riot units, slamming my 80-year-old frame against the concrete sidewalk and binding my wrists with plastic zip ties before the rolling television cameras. As they threw me into the rear of the transport van, I looked up at the West Wing windows in the distance, realizing that I was finally breathing the clean air of absolute personal freedom. The interior of the municipal holding cell became the site of the ultimate emotional reconciliation between my son and myself after 3 decades of ideological war. We sat together on the cold steel bench, our clothes torn and our bodies bruised by the police intervention, but our spirits completely aligned for the first time. Louis looked at my old wrinkled hands, recognizing the deep scars left by decades of carrying the heavy silver trays of the elite, and he wept openly on my shoulder. He realized that my silent endurance inside the halls of power had built the fortress that allowed his generation to stand up and demand absolute systemic justice from the empire. During the short transition administration of President Gerald Ford, I was briefly requested to return as an independent consultant to train the new staff for an upcoming international summit. I agreed to the contract on one condition: that I would be allowed to speak directly to the president regarding the systemic housing discrimination plagues in the inner cities. We met on the private family quarters balcony, away from the watchful eyes of his political handlers and the press corps. I delivered a raw, unvarnished account of the suffering endured by my community, forcing the commander-in-chief to sign an executive directive that expanded federal mortgage protections for minority families across the Midwest. President Jimmy Carter transformed the social dynamic of the White House by demanding that the domestic staff dismantle the rigid 19th century etiquette that had traditionally separated the servants from the first family. He refused to let us wear the formal white gloves during private family dinners, choosing instead to carry his own luggage and invite our children to utilize the executive bowling alleys. He would sit in the kitchen with the butlers after midnight, drinking sweet tea and discussing his anxieties regarding the international hostage crisis that was paralyzing his administration. His profound human humility restored my faith in the potential of the office, proving that a leader could possess absolute power without losing his soul to the machine. The global tension of the nuclear arms race materialized during a historic state dinner for the Soviet delegation at the height of the Geneva negotiations. I was assigned to serve the Premier of the Soviet Union, my movements tracked by both the Secret Service and the KGB agents who stood along the walls with their hands on their weapons. The entire room was an absolute pressure cooker of psychological warfare, where a single dropped fork or an incorrect wine pairing could have been interpreted as an intentional diplomatic insult. I executed the service with a clinical freezing perfection, my performance ensuring that the diplomatic channels remained completely clear for the signing of the non-proliferation treaties. The arrival of the senior President George Bush brought a return to the traditional military-style discipline within the domestic ranks of the executive mansion. As a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, he managed the household with an absolute focus on security and informational containment. I observed the frantic deployment of military hardware during the initial Gulf War simulations, my mind mapping the destruction of distant cities, while I quietly arranged the crystal glassware for the victory dinners. The paradox of my life was complete. I was an instrument of comfort for an administration that was currently reshaping the geopolitical map of the world through absolute military violence. The political landscape shifted dramatically with the election of Bill Clinton, who brought a chaotic, energetic, youthful atmosphere to a building that had been dominated by conservative traditions for 12 years. The new staff was informal, loud, and completely ignorant of the historical sacrifices that had secured the rights of minority workers within the federal system. I spent weeks defending the older colored maids and cooks from being replaced by trendy, young corporate catering firms from New York. I used my position as a respected elder of the Butler Corps to enforce the legacy of our service, reminding the new administration that our presence was the actual moral anchor of the building. The terrifying morning of September 11, 2001, transformed the White House into an active military bunker, within seconds of the planes striking the Twin Towers. As the sirens wailed across the city, the Secret Service evacuated the president to an underground command center, ordering the domestic staff to flee into the streets before the impending missile strikes. I refused to leave, walking through the abandoned halls to ensure that the historical portraits of the past leaders were safely secured in the fireproof vaults beneath the basement. I stood alone in the empty Oval Office while the skies outside were filled with fighter jets, realizing that the empire I had served was just as fragile as the cotton fields of my youth. Following the death of Ronald Reagan, I received an unexpected official invitation from the family estate to travel to California to serve as an honorary pallbearer for his national funeral service. The invitation was a profound shock to my community, given my public defiance against his foreign policy during my final years at the White House. I stood beside the casket at the National Cathedral, looking at the symbols of state power, realizing that despite our deep ideological battles, my decades of silent service had made me a permanent part of his personal history. I walked behind the caisson, my old black suit fitting me like armor as I helped lay the conservative icon to his permanent rest. The Library of Congress approached my frame in 2005, requesting that I donate my personal diaries and letters to create a permanent historical archive dedicated to the lives of minority workers in the executive branch. I spent 3 months organizing the documents, my fingers tracing the letters written by 8 different presidents, alongside the arrest records of my son and the military medals of my deceased child. The archive was a raw, unvarnished testament to the double life of the colored butler, a physical proof that the history of the United States was written just as much by the men who cleared the tables as by the men who sat at them. The political universe experienced a seismic shift when a young senator from Illinois announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States, his campaign message carrying the exact words that my son had shouted on the protest lines 40 years ago. I watched the primary debates from my small living room, my eyes filling with tears as I saw a man who carried the blood of my ancestors stand on the national stage as an equal competitor for the ultimate seat of power. My son Louis bought 2 tickets to the Democratic National Convention, guiding my fragile frame into the massive arena where we watched the historic nomination materialize before our eyes. The morning after the historic election victory of Barack Obama, an official courier from the Presidential Inaugural Committee arrived at my doorstep, holding a gold-embossed envelope. The letter requested my presence not as a guest in the general audience, but as an official guest of honor sitting on the primary platform, directly behind the swearing-in podium. The chief coordinator stated that the incoming president explicitly requested the presence of the oldest living White House butler to validate the historical lineage of his victory. I looked at the gold lettering, my old hands trembling as I realized that my long journey through the shadows of the empire was about to be brought into the absolute light of the midday sun. On the morning of January 20, 2009, I stood before my bedroom mirror to put on my formal tuxedo for the final time in my life. This was not the uniform of servitude that I had worn to please the white masters of the plantation or the political elite of the West Wing. This was the suit of a free citizen who had survived the storms of history. I adjusted my black bow tie, my movements slow and deliberate, my mind reflecting on the long road that had carried my frame from the blood-stained cotton fields of Virginia to the highest pinnacle of the American Republic. My son Louis guided my fragile frame up the marble steps of the United States Capitol, the cold winter air filled with the sounds of millions of citizens singing songs of generational liberation. The security guards looked at my guest of honor badge, immediately clearing a path through the crowds of wealthy politicians and foreign dignitaries who turned to look at my old face with deep historical reverence. I took my seat on the high platform, looking out at the massive sea of humanity that stretched all the way to the Lincoln Memorial, realizing that the country had finally caught up to the dreams of my children. The entire arena fell into an absolute majestic silence as the young African-American leader stepped forward to place his hand on the historic Bible used by Abraham Lincoln. I leaned forward from my chair, my breath suspended in my chest as the Chief Justice read the ancient words of the presidential oath of office. When the final phrase, "So help me God," resonated across the plaza, the entire world seemed to shift on its axis, a profound psychological explosion that validated the silent suffering of millions of souls who had died in the shadows of the Republic. Following the formal completion of the inaugural address, the new president requested that I accompany him into the Oval Office for a private moment before the commencement of the official parade. I stepped into the room that I had cleaned for 34 years, my eyes noticing the radical transformation of the space, which now featured a bust of Martin Luther King beside the executive desk. The president turned to look at my frame, took both of my old worn hands in his own, and thanked me for maintaining the structural dignity of the House until his generation could arrive to claim it. The current White House Butler Corps organized a private reception in the state dining room to honor my return, presenting me with a custom silver serving tray that had been engraved with the names of the 8 presidents I had served. The young butlers, many of whom were minority men and women holding advanced college degrees, stood in a circle to listen to my advice. I told them that their uniform was not a symbol of submission, but a garment of absolute sovereignty, and that their duty was to remind the leaders of the nation that the eyes of history were always watching from the corners of the room. The next afternoon, Louis and I traveled to the National Cemetery to visit the quiet grave of my youngest son, Charlie, who had died in the jungles of Vietnam 40 years ago. I placed the gold inaugural medal directly on the stone marker, the metal clinking against the granite with a sharp clinical resonance that broke the silence of the hillside. I looked up at the gray sky, informing my boy that his sacrifice had not been forgotten by the country, and that the flag wrapping his memory was finally flying over a nation that acknowledged his absolute equality. My old telephone terminal rang on a quiet evening in late winter, the voice on the other end carrying the warm, familiar cadence of Nancy Reagan, who was calling from her estate in California. She wished me good health, admitting that her late husband had often reflected on our long conversations in the Oval Office, and that he had deeply respected my moral courage during the final years of his administration. We spent an hour sharing memories of the old house, our conversation devoid of political ideology, united entirely by the shared experience of having managed the intimate human details of the leaders of the free world. The administrative archive of the federal government officially declassified my private security dossier, revealing that 3 different administrations had secretly designated my frame as an essential asset to national stability during times of global crisis. The documents proved that my quiet intervention had prevented multiple diplomatic catastrophes, and that my absolute discretion had saved the reputations of some of the most powerful men in history. I sat on my front porch holding the papers, the bright afternoon sun illuminating the text, realizing that my life as a silent observer had been a powerful engine of historical transformation. The twilight of my life did not conclude with a theatrical display of victory or a public speech before the microphones of the press corps. It ended quietly on a freezing Tuesday evening inside the small laundry room of my home, where my old hands were washing the yellowed cotton shirts my father had worn in the fields decades ago. There were no flashing studio lights, no silver trays, and no dramatic cinematic monologues to break the absolute stillness of the winter night. I sat down in an old wooden chair, looking at the television screen as the news broadcast showed the empty corridors of the White House after the new president had retired for the evening. The camera slowly panned across the polished mahogany tables where I had left my youth, capturing only the faint circular marks left by the coffee cups I had wiped away for 8 consecutive administrations. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of clean fabric and old memories, completely satisfied with the reality that my life had been a silent, unshakable foundation for the freedom my children now possessed. The screen inside the room did not flicker, the house did not dissolve, and the silence remained absolute as the fire in the hearth slowly turned to gray ash, and the darkness gently claimed the final chapter of my journey.